Hello and welcome to the Wildlife Moto channel. So today's video is a quick status update on the BMW build, the 1981 R100CS, because it's been a while since I uploaded any updates on the channel about this bike. Now that's not because the project stalled, it's not because I've lost interest or there's been any big dramas. It's literally because there is so much stuff happening all over the place. It's been almost impossible to kind of bring it all together in one video. At the moment, there are bits of this bike all over the country. There's engines being rebuilt, gearbox being rebuilt, frames getting powder coated. In fact, lots of stuff's getting powder coated. All kinds of stuff happening all over the place. But in the next few weeks, things will start coming back to the garage. We'll be through that kind of mechanical rebuild phase, and we can start actually putting this bike back together. That's the exciting stuff. So all of that's coming up. I'll talk to you about what's been happening in terms of all those individual processes as well. But before we do that, a quick kind of recap for people who might not know about this build, who might not have seen some of the previous videos. It was back in November last year I bought this bike. It cost about $4,500. It's a 1981 R100CS. It's actually my birth year bike. And it is a bit of a throwback machine in some ways. It's a throwback to the legendary R90S. Some say that was a bike that kind of saved BMW. It was the first sports touring machine that they made, a real kind of luxury premium machine. And if it wasn't for that bike, you could argue that today we probably wouldn't have things like, the S1000 RR, the GS maybe as well. It really was a very important bike for BMW. And the CS is a bit of a throwback. It came out a couple of years after the R90S finished its run, but there were quite a few improvements on it, like better brakes, better electronics, things like a lighter flywheel, a lighter clutch, a bigger engine, all that kind of stuff just made it a little bit more modern. But it is still really a very classic bike. It's a 42-year-old machine. It is absolutely charming to ride it. It's a beautiful thing. It feels really capable in terms of being able to get you around. It's a classic bike that's actually still usable in today's world. And I've owned some of the most modern bikes around, things like my V4 Tuono, my KTM 1290 Super Adventure S, I've had Ducatis and things like that. And while it doesn't hold its own in terms of performance, not even close, it does in terms of its usability on the roads today. It's just a wonderful bike to have. So I was really keen to not only keep this bike on the road, but to keep it as kind of usable as possible and actually create a bike that I could actually get out and tour on and do all that kind of stuff. So when I first got it, I didn't really have a plan. I started kind of tinkering around with it as you do. There were a few really obvious things that I wanted to sort out. Things like the exhaust that was a bit bashed up. There were a few kind of plastic bits on it that were broken and stuff like that. So I just started digging into it. And from there, things kind of started going a bit crazy. I kind of lost my ability to look beyond some of the things that you just expect to see on old bikes, like corrosion and just the throes of entropy, if you like, all over the bike. I was just like, okay, I can't deal with this. I need to get this thing perfect. So that's what I did. I just pulled it apart. I took everything off the bike, and that's currently, where we're kind of at in terms of that stage of things. So I'll talk you through each part of the bike, give you a bit of an update in terms of where it's at, and then we can talk about what comes next. So let's start at the front of the bike. And well, what better place to start than the wheels? They've been a bit of a nightmare, actually. I got a call recently from the guys who were changing the tyres on the bike, because I'm going to get new tyres. I think the current tyres were from about 2011 or something like that, so they needed to be changed. And they said, you've got a bit of a problem here. Your wheels are buckled. I said, what? Just the front one? They're like, no, both of them. So both of the wheels are a little bit out of shape, which is a problem. Now, you've got two options there. Obviously, you can try to get them fixed, and there are people out there who specialize in doing that, or you can replace them. So I went down the latter route and decided that it would probably be better to get not a new set, but buy source a second-hand set that didn't have any buckling on them, just because I didn't really want to risk trying to fix these wheels. Apparently they are quite soft. The alley that's used in these wheels is notoriously easy to buckle. So I don't think anyone's tried to do any crazy stunts on it. It may just have been a case of nipping a pothole or whatever. But we've got two new, not new, but new to me wheels on this bike now. So that's been an expensive process to get through. What I'm actually going to do with these wheels as well, and a little bit of controversy here, is I'm going to powder coat them black. I know, that's not going to be for everyone, but throughout this bike we're going for a little bit of a blacked out theme. Now, it's one of the reasons why I'm pleased I got a CS rather than an R90S, because if I was doing a whole R90S thing, I'd probably be slightly hamstrung into doing a bit of a museum grade restoration. The CS is not quite so protected as the R90S, so I can kind of let the leash off a little bit and get a little bit creative. So we've got some black wheels going to go on there. All of the usual stuff is going to happen with those wheels, so all new bearings, all that kind of stuff. Now, while we're down there talking about wheels, we also need to talk about the brakes as well, because these have been a bit of a problem. I've talked about this in previous videos. The Brembo solid rotors that come on this bike out of the box have probably been on there for decades, and they were warped. It's quite common with those solid rotors. It's just a case of heat getting in there and it can distort the metal slightly. So I felt that through the lever when I first got the bike, a slight kind of pulsing sensation, which wasn't right at all, made it actually quite dangerous. So they're going to get replaced with EBC ProLite rotors, which are floating rotors and are going to give us much better heat management. So again, just a little bit of a modern touch to improve things there. The calipers themselves have also been completely stripped of everything. So all the pistons, all the seals, all the internal pins and all that kind of stuff, the brake pads, all come out, all binned, and will be replaced with brand new stuff. So that's going to happen too. The actual cast calipers themselves have gone off. They've been stripped and they're going to get Cerakoted in black. So we're just going to have, we'll stick to black, but they're going to be retouched up because they had a few little chips in them and things like that. So they're going to hopefully look as good as new when they come back from the Cerakoters. The other issue I had when I was putting this bike apart was with the forks. So when I started draining the fork oil out of the forks, I found that on the left-hand side of the bike, the oil was perfectly fine. It was kind of a pinky looking oil, looked pretty fresh. But on the right-hand leg, it was a completely different story. Firstly, hardly any oil came out at all. And what did come out was this kind of filthy black tar-like substance. So either somebody at some point had just decided to replace the oil in one fork, which would be really weird, or there was something wrong with the seal and, you know, it had got contaminated and what had come out was just, you know, the kind of mucky gunk, which was as a result of not being properly sealed in there, possibly. Anyway, the entire thing's going to get stripped. So the forks have gone off to get rebuilt. That's going to involve all new seals, new springs, all that kind of stuff, new fork caps, everything basically. All the internals inside the forks are going to get completely refreshed. The reason I'm going to change the springs is not because I want to change any of the kind of setup or get the same kind of progressive springs that were in there. It's just because over time they can get a little bit soft in terms of the elasticity of the spring. So it's probably better, considering they're about 42 years old, just to replace those. So that's going to happen as well. As we kind of move up the bike, we can talk about the paint as well, because the mudguard is completely repainted, as is the front fairing. All the paintwork on this bike was sent to a company called Ace Classics, who completely stripped everything, and they've painted it a beautiful gloss, almost like piano black, this gorgeous deep black. Now again, this is another little bit of creativity thrown in there, because it's not the same spec as the BMW paint on the CS, which would have been a metallic black. Just a little bit of a fleck to it, which gave it a bit of a kind of greeny, bluey tinge. I wasn't a big fan. I wanted to go with a real classic black, but I have kept all the pinstriping as you would expect. It's got a single pinstripe on the mudguard. Everything else has got double gold pinstripes up on the fairing and on the fuel tank and on the seat cowl as well. So I'm really happy with how the paintwork turned out. It looks absolutely amazing. So moving up the stanchions, we get to the top fork yoke. And I've talked about this in other videos. That's been replaced from the flimsy bit of stamped steel to the toaster tan top yoke, which is just a little bit more chunky, and it's supposed to just reduce some of the flex to kind of make the bike feel a little bit stiffer, because it does kind of weave about a little bit. So that's supposed to be one of the things you can do to fix it. So we'll see how well that works. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to have to do a little bit of surgery on the bike's ears. Now they call them ears, they are basically headlight brackets that sit over the top of the stanchions and hold the headlight in place. In order to fit the toaster tan fork brace, because it's a little bit thicker, well actually quite a lot thicker, I need to cut about 18 mil off the top of each of those ears with my Dremel. So when those come back from the powder coaters, that's going to be the first thing to do on those, which is going to be a little bit scary, but hopefully, fingers crossed, it should be all right. So elsewhere, up at the controls, we've got the handlebars that have been completely refurbished. So these bars are the original bars from the bike that were sent off to a company called RS Chrome, who stripped them, polished up all the steel, and then completely replated them. They look absolutely amazing, so I'm really happy with how they turned out. Also, all the controls themselves, all the levers and the perches and the brake master cylinder and all that were stripped and have been Cerakoted black. So that was done by a company called Ragged Moto, and they've done an absolutely fantastic job. They look absolutely amazing. I'm so happy with how they turned out. Then inside the brake master cylinder, all the components there have also been changed. So we've got a new spring in there, and we've also got a new reservoir up there as well for the fluid, because that was looking a little bit worn out. So continuing to move up, inside the fairing, the plastic shroud that holds in place things like the voltmeter and the clock, that's been replaced because the original was all cracked. So that's all done. And also the windscreen itself, that's been changed out from the clear version that came on the bike, which was looking a little bit crusty and yellow and a bit kind of scratched up. It's been replaced with a smoke version, which again just kind of leans into that slightly blacked out look that I'm going for on this bike. I think it looks absolutely amazing. So that's the kind of front section of the bike. Then moving back a little bit, let's talk about the frame. So the frame itself, once everything was stripped off, was sent to get powder coated. Now all the powder coating on this bike, which includes the main frame, the subframe, the swing arm, and the bottom of the fork legs and all that stuff, is going to be done in a kind of satin powder coat. It's kind of a glossy matte or a matty gloss. But I have got a few pictures back from the powder coaters. You can see a little sneak peek here at some of that stuff, and it does look rather good. So well pleased with how that's turned out. Elsewhere, the engine itself has been completely rebuilt. Now, a lot of people, when they do these BMW rebuilds, they don't do the engine because they focus more on the kind of aesthetic stuff, and a lot of people do kind of calf racer customizations and all that kind of stuff with these bikes, but they don't often touch the engine because I think in a lot of cases the engines are kind of in working order. And that's the weird thing about these BMWs, because they're so well built, because they're kind of so over-engineered, they will just run forever. Now, whether they're running properly or whether they're running at their optimum capability is another story, and very often they're not. They're just kind of hanging on in there. So in order to get the very most out of this bike in terms of longevity and reliability and all that stuff, I decided I'll just have the engine completely rebuilt. And that's not just a top end rebuild, that's not just a little bit of a service, that's a strip down to the crank, nuts and bolts rebuild of the whole thing. Yeah, pretty expensive to get that done, but I'm glad I did. So all the kind of service items that you would expect to change in an engine rebuild have been done. Everything from like timing chains and bearings and seals and valve seats and all that stuff, all been done. There were a couple of things in there as well that were, let's call them nasty surprises, because that's what they were. So some things we weren't expecting were with the actual cylinder barrels themselves. Because my bike is a 1981 bike, it was around the time when BMW introduced Nickel, which is basically just a coating on the barrel liners to supposedly make the whole system a bit more robust. It's a very kind of hard plating inside the barrels. But in my bike, it was completely worn out. So what we've had to do is send the barrels off to get re-nickel sealed, which is quite expensive. And also the pistons, especially on one side, I think it was the right-hand side, had gone quite out of round. So both of the pistons are going to get replaced as well, which again is just another expense there. So outside of that, nothing too major with the engine, apart from just the usual items that you would replace during a full engine rebuild. So that's done. The crank, as you can see here, has been kind of put back into the casing. All of those cases were sent off and vapor blasted as well as part of that process. I did manage to resist the urge to get everything Cerakoted black. I was thinking about that at one point, but we're just going to keep it raw alley. I think it looks absolutely beautiful. I will get this properly kind of sprayed up with ACF 50 to hopefully stave off any future corrosion, but we're going to keep it raw, which is going to look great. The only parts that are going to be Cerakoted on the engine will be the timing chest, the starter motor cover, and the rocker box covers. They're all going to be Cerakoted, and what I'm going to do is just sand back the extremities of the engine fins, so we'll get that nice kind of shiny alley look on the end of the fins, but everything else will be, you know, that kind of slightly satiny Cerakote look on the black, which I think is going to look great. So that's the engine done, and that's currently in the final stages of getting put back together. The next part was the gearbox, and again that was a bit of a Pandora's box of horrors, let's call it that. So once that was opened up, immediately the guys spotted that there were some issues that needed to be sorted out, and that was with the helical gears that, well, actually don't ask me too much about how all this works. I don't really know. It's something to do with fifth gear anyway, but there's 3 helical gears inside that gearbox, and they were all slightly worn to the point where it was just worth replacing those. So that's all been done as part of the gearbox rebuild too. All the usual bits and pieces in the gearbox have been done in terms of service items, all kind of new seals and bearings and all that kind of stuff. The cases have also been vapor blasted, so they look beautiful. But it was a bit of an expensive process to get everything back to spec with the gearbox. So it's done. And again, you know, that will be another part that's coming back in the next few weeks. Elsewhere, the swing arm. So in order to get that powder coated, if you want to get your swing arm powder coated, unfortunately, because this is a shaft driven bike, you have to take out all the internals. So you've got your main shaft that runs all the way through the swing arm. It connects to the output flange on the gearbox, and then it goes all the way through to the final drive, obviously. So that had to be pulled apart. There's a special tool that you need to do that. So you have to like compress there's a kind of dampening spring in there that needs to be compressed, and then you can take out all the internals for the swing arm. So that's been done. It got sent off and powder coated, again the same kind of satin black as the frame and the wheels and all that. It's been rebuilt, and it's now just waiting to go back on the bike in due course. The final drive as well, which connects to the swing arm and then connects to the wheel, that's also been completely stripped and serviced too. So again, bearings and all that kind of stuff in the final drive all replaced, and the main body itself has been vapor blasted back to raw aluminium. Luckily, the main spline in there was all fine, so didn't have to worry about doing that because it's quite an expensive thing to change out. So that's all still in good nick after about 58,000 miles or so. So happy days there. The only other thing inside the final drive that needed to be sorted out was the brake pads, the kind of shoes that sit inside the drum brake there. They were all a little bit kind of glazed up and slightly separating from the base metal on the pad. So they're going to be changed as well to EBC pads. So there you go, that's the mechanical stuff. Elsewhere, things like the seat, I'm going to keep the factory seat on the bike. I don't think I need to change the foam or anything like that. It feels perfectly comfortable to me. It's all in good condition. The main seat pan and the cowl and all that, that's all been painted by Ace Classics as well. So we've got that beautiful kind of black theme across everything there. Elsewhere, the carburetors have also been completely rebuilt. They were stripped apart by a company called East Anglia Vapor Blasting. What they did was replace all the jets, the floats, the diaphragms, reset everything back to factory, and the cases themselves were also completely vapor blasted back to beautiful raw aluminium, and have been ACF 50'd as well. So I'm looking forward to getting those back on the bike. The suspension on the back of the bike is also going to get upgraded too. So I'm taking off the Koni dial-a-ride shocks that are currently on my machine. This was a popular upgrade to do back in the day. These aren't the original shocks that the bike would have been sold with, I don't think, but they are pretty old. So I'm going to replace those with a set of these. These are the Hagon Nitro fully adjustable shock absorbers, and they come in at about £470 for a pair. So they do sit slightly more towards the higher end of Hagon's product offering, but you get quite a lot of features for your money. First up, we've got an entirely stainless steel body and spring, and we've got silver anodized aluminium hardware that connects it to the bike. Now you've got these big sturdy 73mm springs backed up by an 18mm chromed piston that runs straight through the middle there. We've got quite a bit of adjustability on these as well. We've got 10 positions of damping control with what Hagen call automatic compression and rebound balance thrown in there as well. And as you would expect, loads of preload adjustability too. Now when you order these, the best thing to do is to give Hagen a call and give them your dimensions in terms of your weight, any luggage that you're going to be carrying, how you like to ride, whether or not you have a pillion and your pillion's weight, and then they will send these shocks pre-made to order with the correct spring rate set up and all that kind of stuff for your profile. So that's the suspension. Other bits and pieces to talk about. So generally talking about electrics and things like that, I have decided to stick with the OEM loom. And the loom on the bike is actually in pretty good condition. I just had to clean it all out and just make sure all the plugs are okay. But I've decided to change some of the electrical components. Things like the Bosch coils, the two big Bosch coils. I'm going to drop those, get rid of those and replace those with a single unit, much more modern system, which is much smaller, much lighter, and should be a lot more reliable as well. So it's just a single unit that takes care of the sparks on both sides of the bike. I'm going to also replace things like the rectifier, just for a more modern unit, just because the one that's on the bike is pretty old and pretty tired. I mean, it seemed to work okay, but I might as well change it while I'm here. And I'll also change things like the starter relay and all that kind of stuff. Apart from that, things like the alternator, the diode board, the actual loom itself will all stay on the bike. Inside the headlight shell, everything actually looked pretty good. There wasn't much corrosion in there. Everything looked quite fresh, to be completely honest. I was quite surprised when I opened that up. Everything's well organized, looks okay. Some of the sub harnesses have been rebuilt, so the harnesses that run out to the indicators, and I might redo the harness that runs up to the clock and the voltmeter and all that kind of stuff, just because some of those are looking a little bit tired. But for the most part, the factory loom's in pretty good condition and it should be good to go for many miles ahead. So pleased to say the electrics are okay. Other things that will probably end up getting changed on the bike will be things like control lines. So I'll probably go for the Venhill Featherlight control lines for the throttle. Then on the choke, I was actually thinking I could clean up the bike a little bit by removing the choke on the bars and actually having two little manual pulleys on either side of the carburetor. It's quite a common mod that a lot of people do on like the cafe racer style bikes and all that. It just means that we get to lose one of the unsightly cable systems that run up from the engine to the bars. So we just have two little pulleys on either side of the carburetors. You know, it just cleans it up a little bit. It might end up being a bit more of a faff than it's worth. We'll see, we'll see. The brake lines, I'll probably change the brake lines as well. The current lines on the bike look okay, but I think they've been on there for a while. They've gone a little bit kind of yellowy, so we'll probably just end up getting new lines and new banjos and all that kind of stuff on there as well. I think that pretty much covers everything. I've probably forgotten a couple of small little bits and pieces, but for the most part, you get the idea. This is really a proper kind of nuts and bolts rebuild. In fact, talking about nuts and bolts, I will also order one of those packs, if you like, of stainless steel fasteners, so that as I'm going through putting stuff back on the bike, we'll just switch out all of the old fasteners with new stainless steel fasteners. And little bits and pieces like the center stand springs and all that kind of stuff, they'll all get changed out. In fact, the other thing to talk about is the exhaust system. So I've polished all that up. The headers look absolutely beautiful on this bike now. So can't wait to get those back on. We'll get new exhaust nuts and things like that on there. The silencers, I've already replaced one of the silencers because that was all dinged up when I first got it. So we've got beautiful stainless steel silencers, beautiful stainless steel headers, and that's all kind of ready to go. So that covers most of the main stuff that's been going on the bike. And as you can imagine, there's been a lot of work happening, all spread out all over the four corners of the country, lots of stuff going on. And now we're getting towards that point where things are going to start arriving back at the garage, and then it's going to be on me again to actually put all that stuff in some kind of order, and hopefully out comes a motorbike off the back end of that. So watch this space. Don't forget to hit subscribe for those videos when they drop, and until the next one, ride safe.